Sarah Martinez had always been good at blending in. At 34 years old, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with shoulder-length brown hair and gentle hazel eyes that most people found warm and approachable. She wore a simple navy blue sweater and dark jeans as she sat in the corner booth of Murphy's Coffee Shop, a small local cafe in downtown Portland, Oregon. To anyone watching, she looked like any other customer enjoying her morning coffee and reading a book. The truth was far more complex. Sarah had spent 12 years in the United States Navy, with 8 of those years as a Navy SEAL. She was part of an elite group of women who had broken barriers and proven themselves in one of the military's most demanding roles. Her service record included 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Syria, and countless classified missions that would never appear in any public documentation. She had earned a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and the respect of every man and woman she had served alongside. But that was her past life. Now, 6 months after leaving active duty, Sarah was trying to build something different. She had moved to Portland to start fresh, away from the intensity and constant danger of military life. She worked as a security consultant for local businesses, helping them assess and improve their safety protocols. It was quiet work, methodical and peaceful, exactly what she thought she needed to transition back to civilian life. The morning had started like any other. Sarah had woken at 5:30, a habit from her military days that she couldn't shake. She had gone for a run through the nearby park, returned home to her small apartment, showered, and then walked the 6 blocks to Murphy's Coffee Shop. The routine gave her comfort and structure in a world that sometimes felt too loose and uncontrolled after years of rigid military discipline. Murphy's was owned by an elderly Irish man named Patrick Murphy, who had immigrated to Portland 40 years earlier. Patrick was in his 70s now, with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and genuine smiles. He had opened the coffee shop 30 years ago as a place where neighbors could gather, talk, and feel like part of a community. The walls were covered with local artwork, shelves lined with used books that customers could buy or trade, and tables that had been worn smooth by decades of conversations and coffee cups. Sarah had discovered Murphy's during her second week in Portland. She had been walking through the neighborhood, still learning the streets and trying to feel at home, when the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods had drawn her inside. Patrick had welcomed her with the kind of genuine warmth that made her feel less alone in a new city. Since then, she had become a regular, usually arriving around 8 in the morning and staying for an hour before heading to whatever job site required her attention that day. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Sarah had chosen her usual corner booth, which gave her a clear view of the entire coffee shop. It was another habit from her military training, always positioning herself where she could see potential threats and exit routes. Most of the time, she didn't even think about it consciously, but today something felt different. The coffee shop was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning. There were the regular customers that Sarah recognized, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who came in every day for a small black coffee and always sat by the window reading Chinese newspapers, Marcus, a college student who spent hours studying with his textbooks spread across an entire table, and Janet, a local artist who sketched portraits of other customers while nursing a single latte for hours. But there were also 3 men Sarah didn't recognize, and something about them made her instincts sharpen. They had entered separately, about 10 minutes apart, but Sarah noticed they kept glancing at each other in a way that suggested they were together. The first man was tall and thin with nervous energy, constantly checking his phone and looking around the room. The second was shorter and stockier, with tattoos covering his arms and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The third man was average height but moved with a tension that reminded Sarah of coiled springs. These men didn't fit the usual pattern of Murphy's customers. They weren't reading, working on laptops, or engaging in the casual conversation that filled the coffee shop most mornings. Instead, they seemed to be watching and waiting, and their presence created an undercurrent of unease that Sarah felt in her bones. Patrick Murphy moved between tables with his usual friendly efficiency, refilling coffee cups and chatting with regular customers. At 73 years old, he still insisted on working every day, claiming that retirement would kill him faster than any amount of work. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier, and the coffee shop had become not just his business but his primary source of human connection and purpose. Sarah watched as Patrick approached the table where the tall, nervous man was sitting. She couldn't hear their conversation from across the room, but she could see Patrick's friendly smile and welcoming gestures. The man's responses seemed short and tense, and Sarah noticed that he kept one hand in his jacket pocket while they talked. It was then that Sarah's training kicked into high gear. She recognized the signs of someone carrying a concealed weapon, the way the man's shoulders were positioned, how he kept his dominant hand free, and the bulge in his jacket that suggested something heavier than a wallet or phone. Her heartbeat remained steady, but every muscle in her body prepared for action. The second man, the one with tattoos, had positioned himself near the front door. Sarah realized he was blocking the main exit, making it impossible for customers to leave without passing directly by him. The third man had moved to a table near the back of the coffee shop, close to the emergency exit that led to the alley behind the building. Sarah's mind automatically began calculating distances, angles, and potential weapons within reach. The coffee shop suddenly transformed from a peaceful morning refuge into a tactical scenario. She counted 17 customers plus Patrick, which meant 18 potential civilians who could be caught in whatever was about to happen. Her phone was in her purse, but reaching for it might draw unwanted attention. Instead, Sarah slowly shifted position in her booth, moving to an angle that would give her the best range of motion if she needed to act quickly. She kept her movements casual and natural, taking a sip of her coffee and turning a page in her book as if she was simply getting more comfortable. The tall man stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made several customers look up from their morning routines. Sarah saw him exchange a quick look with his two companions, some kind of silent signal that confirmed her worst fears. Whatever they had planned was about to begin. Patrick Murphy was refilling Mrs. Chen's coffee cup when the tall man approached him from behind. Sarah saw the flash of metal as the man pulled a gun from his jacket, the morning sunlight catching the barrel as he pressed it against Patrick's back. "Everyone stay calm and nobody gets hurt," the man announced in a voice that was trying to sound confident but carried an unmistakable tremor of nervousness. "This is just business." The coffee shop erupted into chaos. Mrs. Chen dropped her newspaper and pressed her hand to her chest. Marcus slammed his textbook shut and looked wildly around for an escape route that no longer existed. Janet's sketching pencil fell to the floor as her hands began to shake. Other customers started to stand, sit back down, reach for phones, then think better of it as they realized the gravity of the situation. "Phones on the tables, hands where I can see them," the man with the gun continued, his voice growing more agitated as he tried to maintain control of the situation. "This will all be over in a few minutes if everyone just cooperates." Patrick Murphy, to his credit, remained remarkably calm. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "There's no need for the gun, son. Whatever you need, we can work it out." "Shut up, old man," the gunman snapped. "Just open the register and give us what's in there." Sarah realized this was supposed to be a simple robbery. 3 men, 1 gun, minimal resistance expected from a coffee shop full of civilians and an elderly owner. What they didn't know was that one of those civilians had spent years training for exactly this type of situation. But Sarah also knew that her biggest advantage was that they didn't know who she was. To them, she looked like any other customer, someone to be controlled and ignored while they completed their crime. If she acted too quickly or too obviously, she might lose that advantage and put innocent lives at risk. Instead, Sarah began to move with the calculated patience that had made her successful in dozens of real combat situations. She slowly reached into her purse, not for her phone, but for a tactical pen she always carried, a seemingly innocent writing instrument that could become a devastating weapon in trained hands. The tattooed man by the door was watching the room, but his attention was focused on the larger groups of customers and the most obvious threats. He glanced at Sarah briefly, saw a woman sitting alone with a book and coffee, and dismissed her as harmless. The third man near the back exit was growing nervous. Sarah could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool October morning. He kept looking between his companions and the emergency exit, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. "Hurry up with that register," the gunman demanded, pressing the weapon harder against Patrick's back. "We don't have all day." Patrick's hands shook slightly as he worked the old mechanical cash register, a vintage model that required more effort than the electronic systems most businesses used. The register made its characteristic bell sound as it opened, a cheerful noise that seemed horribly out of place in the tense atmosphere. "That's it," the gunman said, looking at the modest amount of cash in the drawer. "This is all you've got?" "It's Tuesday morning," Patrick replied quietly. "Most people pay with cards these days." "This is really all there is?" Sarah could see the gunman's frustration mounting. This was clearly not going according to whatever plan they had made. The amount of money in the register was probably less than $100, nowhere near enough to justify the risk they were taking or to satisfy whatever need had driven them to robbery in the first place. The man with tattoos called out from his position by the door. "Come on, let's just take it and go. This is taking too long." But the gunman seemed frozen in indecision, the weapon still pressed against Patrick's back, his free hand hovering over the small pile of bills in the register. Sarah recognized the signs of someone in over their head, someone who had expected an easy score and was now facing the reality that crime was more complicated and yielded less reward than they had imagined. It was precisely this kind of hesitation and poor planning that created opportunities, and Sarah began to position herself to take advantage of whatever opening might present itself. She shifted slightly in her seat, the tactical pen now concealed in her right hand, her body coiled and ready to move. The next few seconds would determine whether this remained a simple robbery or escalated into something much more dangerous. Sarah had seen enough situations like this to know that desperate people with weapons made unpredictable and often violent decisions when their plans started to fall apart. She caught Patrick's eye for just a moment, and something in her calm, steady gaze seemed to give him strength. He nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent communication between two people who understood that they were about to face a crisis together. The gunman was starting to panic, his grip on the weapon becoming less steady, his breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. Sarah knew from experience that this was the most dangerous phase of any confrontation, when fear and desperation could cause someone to make irreversible mistakes. "You know what?" the gunman said suddenly, his voice rising with frustration and anger. "I think you're holding out on us, old man. I think there's more money here somewhere, and you're going to tell us where it is." He grabbed Patrick by the shoulder and spun him around, pressing the gun directly against his forehead. "Where's the safe? Where do you keep the real money?" "There is no safe," Patrick said quietly, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced under stress. "What you see is what there is. I'm sorry, but this is just a small neighborhood coffee shop. We don't keep large amounts of cash on hand." The gunman's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Sarah could see that he was reaching a breaking point, the kind of moment when someone might do something irreversibly stupid and violent. "You're lying," he snarled, pushing the gun harder against Patrick's forehead. "Nobody runs a business with this little money. You've got it hidden somewhere, and you're going to tell me where it is right now, or I'm going to blow your brains out in front of all these nice people." That was when Sarah decided she had waited long enough. The situation had escalated beyond what could be resolved peacefully, and an innocent man's life was now in immediate danger. Her years of training took over, and the quiet woman reading a book in the corner booth disappeared, replaced by someone who had been forged in the crucible of military combat. But Sarah also knew that her next actions would have to be perfect. She would have only one chance to act before the situation became a tragedy, and everything she had learned in 12 years of military service was about to be put to the ultimate test in a small coffee shop in Portland, Oregon. The gunman pressed the weapon against Patrick's head and began to count down. 5, 4, 3. Sarah moved. Sarah's movement was faster than anything the three criminals had expected or prepared for. In a single fluid motion, she rose from her booth and crossed the 12 feet between herself and the gunman in less than 2 seconds. Her tactical pen was already in motion before the man with the gun realized what was happening. The first strike hit a precise nerve cluster in the gunman's wrist, causing his hand to spasm and his grip on the weapon to loosen immediately. Pain shot up his arm like an electric shock, and his fingers involuntarily opened. The gun fell toward the floor, but Sarah was already moving to catch it before it could hit the ground and potentially discharge. Her left hand secured the weapon while her right hand continued the attack, driving the tactical pen toward a pressure point on the gunman's neck that would render him unconscious within seconds. But, even as she moved with deadly efficiency, Sarah was calculating the positions and likely reactions of the other two men in the room. The tattooed man by the door was the first to react. He had been watching the room casually, expecting nothing more challenging than frightened customers who would cooperate until his companions finished their business. When he saw Sarah's explosive movement and witnessed his partner's weapon being taken away with surgical precision, he reached for his own gun, which had been concealed in a shoulder holster under his jacket. Sarah saw his movement in her peripheral vision and made a split-second decision that would determine whether anyone else got hurt in the next few moments. Instead of completing the pressure point attack that would have knocked the first gunman unconscious, she grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around, using his body as a shield while she brought the captured weapon up to a ready position. "Federal agent," she shouted, though it wasn't technically true anymore. The words carried authority and might buy her precious seconds of confusion from the other attackers. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground." The tattooed man hesitated, his own gun halfway out of its holster. He found himself in an impossible position, with his partner between him and this woman who had appeared from nowhere and taken control of the situation in a matter of seconds. If he fired, he would likely hit his own accomplice. The third man, positioned near the back exit, had a clearer shot at Sarah, but he was clearly the least experienced of the three. His hands shook as he tried to draw a pistol from his waistband, and Sarah could see him struggling with the decision of whether to shoot or run. "Nobody else has to get hurt," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command situations under extreme pressure. "Put your weapons down and walk away. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone." But, even as she offered them a way out, Sarah was preparing for the likelihood that they would choose violence over surrender. Her mind automatically catalogued the positions of all the civilians in the room, identifying which ones were in potential lines of fire and calculating how she could move to protect them if shooting started. Mrs. Chen had crawled under her table and was pressed against the wall, her face pale with terror but her body positioned safely behind solid cover. Marcus, the college student, had dropped to the floor behind his chair and was trying to make himself as small as possible. Janet, the artist, had frozen in place, her sketching materials scattered around her as she stared in shock at the sudden transformation of her peaceful morning into a life-or-death confrontation. Patrick Murphy had stumbled backward when Sarah spun the gunman away from him, but he was now standing behind the counter, his eyes wide with amazement and fear. Sarah caught his attention for just a moment and gestured with her head toward the back room, indicating that he should move to safer cover. The first gunman, the one Sarah had disarmed, was beginning to recover from the shock and pain of her initial attack. He was bigger than Sarah and probably outweighed her by 60 pounds, and she could feel him starting to struggle against her grip. Holding him as a human shield was becoming more difficult with each passing second. "Last chance," Sarah announced to the other two men. "Drop your weapons or I will consider you active threats and respond accordingly." The military terminology was deliberate. Sarah wanted them to understand that they were no longer dealing with a civilian who might hesitate or show mercy, but with someone who had been trained to end conflicts decisively and permanently if necessary. The tattooed man made his choice. Instead of dropping his weapon, he completed his draw and brought his gun up towards Sarah and his captured partner. It was a desperate move born of panic rather than tactical thinking, and Sarah recognized immediately that he was going to fire despite the risk to his accomplice. Sarah released her human shield and dove to her left, rolling behind the counter where Patrick had taken cover. The tattooed man's shot echoed through the coffee shop like thunder, splintering wood from the old cash register and sending splinters flying in all directions. Customers screamed and dove for whatever cover they could find. The first gunman, freed from Sarah's grip, stumbled forward and crashed into a table, sending coffee cups and pastries flying. He was disoriented and weaponless, but he was also angry and humiliated, which made him dangerous in a different way. Sarah came up from behind the counter with the captured gun raised and ready. She had a clear shot at the tattooed man, but there were civilians in the background, and her military training had ingrained in her an absolute commitment to avoiding collateral damage whenever possible. "Get down," she shouted to the remaining customers. "Everyone on the floor, now." The third man near the back exit finally got his weapon clear and fired wildly in Sarah's direction. His shot was poorly aimed and driven by panic, but it shattered the front window of the coffee shop and sent glass cascading across the floor like deadly rain. Sarah rolled to her right, using the coffee shop's layout to her advantage. She had spent weeks sitting in this room, unconsciously memorizing its geography the way her training had taught her to assess any environment for tactical possibilities. She knew exactly where every table, chair, and potential piece of cover was located. Her next movement took her to a position where she had a clear field of fire toward both remaining armed men while keeping herself behind solid cover. The old coffee shop had been built in an era when construction was more substantial, and the thick wooden beams and solid plaster walls provided real protection rather than the thin drywall that might be found in a more modern building. The tattooed man was trying to advance on her position, moving from table to table in an attempt to get a better angle for a shot. But his movements revealed his lack of training. He exposed himself unnecessarily and moved in predictable patterns that made him an easy target for someone with Sarah's experience. Sarah's first return shot was precisely aimed and devastatingly effective. The bullet struck the tattooed man's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying across the room. He crashed to the ground with a cry of pain and shock, clutching his wounded arm and no longer presenting a threat to anyone. The sound of her gunshot seemed to break the spell that had held the third man frozen in indecision. Instead of continuing to fight, he turned and ran for the back exit, abandoning his wounded partner and his disarmed accomplice in his desperate flight. Sarah let him go. Pursuing him would mean leaving the civilians in the coffee shop unprotected, and she had no way of knowing if there might be additional attackers waiting outside. Her priority was securing the immediate area and ensuring that no one else got hurt. The first gunman, the one who had been holding Patrick hostage, was trying to get to his feet. He was unarmed but still dangerous, and Sarah could see the rage and humiliation burning in his eyes. Some men, when faced with the reality of being defeated by someone they had underestimated, became more rather than less dangerous. "Stay on the ground," Sarah commanded, keeping the captured weapon trained on him. "Hands where I can see them." But the man was beyond rational thought. The humiliation of being disarmed by a woman, the failure of what was supposed to have been an easy robbery, and the shock of seeing his partner's shot had pushed him into a state where pride mattered more than survival. He lunged toward Sarah with his hands outstretched, intending to tackle her and wrestle the gun away. It was a foolish move, the kind of desperation that came from someone who had watched too many action movies and had no understanding of what real combat was like. Sarah sidestepped his charge with minimal effort, using his own momentum against him. As he stumbled past her, she brought the butt of the gun down on the base of his skull with precisely controlled force. It was enough to render him unconscious immediately but not enough to cause permanent damage. He collapsed to the floor and lay still, finally, ending the active phase of the confrontation. The silence that followed was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. Sarah stood in the middle of the coffee shop, weapon still ready, scanning for any remaining threats while her breathing slowly returned to normal. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours had passed since the first gunman had pressed his weapon against Patrick's head. Gradually, customers began to emerge from their hiding places. Mrs. Chen was crying softly, but she appeared to be uninjured. Marcus, the college student, was staring at Sarah with a mixture of amazement and terror, clearly struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Janet, the artist, had pressed herself against the wall and was trembling, but she was safe. Patrick Murphy stood up slowly from behind the counter, his face pale but his eyes bright with gratitude and admiration. "Are you all right, dear?" he asked Sarah, his voice shaky but concerned more for her well-being than his own. Sarah nodded, but she didn't lower the weapon yet. "Is anyone hurt?" she called out to the room in general. "Does anyone need medical attention?" A chorus of voices confirmed that while everyone was shaken, no civilians had been injured in the confrontation. The only casualties were the tattooed gunman, who was conscious but in significant pain from his shoulder wound, and the first gunman, who was unconscious but breathing steadily. Sarah moved to check on the wounded attacker first. Despite the fact that he had been part of a group that had threatened innocent people, her military training had instilled in her a commitment to providing aid to wounded enemies when the tactical situation allowed. She knelt beside him and quickly assessed his injury. The bullet had passed through his shoulder muscle without hitting bone or major arteries. It was painful and would require medical attention, but it was not life-threatening. She used napkins from a nearby table to apply pressure to the wound and slow the bleeding. "Someone needs to call 911, she announced to the room. "Tell them we need police and paramedics, and that the situation is secure, but there are injured people who need medical attention." Marcus pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands and began dialing. Several other customers were also reaching for their phones, eager to do something helpful after the terrifying experience they had just lived through. Sarah moved to check on the unconscious gunman next. His pulse was strong and his breathing was regular, indicating that her strike had been precisely calibrated to render him unconscious without causing serious injury. He would wake up with a severe headache and possibly some temporary disorientation, but there would be no permanent damage. It was then that the questions started. "Who are you?" Patrick asked, his voice filled with wonder. "What kind of training do you have? Are you a police officer?" Mrs. Chen asked in accented English, having found her voice again after the shock of the attack. "I saw you move," Janet said, her artist's eye having captured details that others might have missed. "That wasn't normal. That was like something from a movie, except it was real." Sarah stood up slowly, the captured weapon still in her hand but now pointed safely toward the floor. She realized that her quiet, anonymous life in Portland had just come to an abrupt end. There was no way to explain what had just happened without revealing at least some portion of her background and training. But before she could begin to answer their questions, she heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. The police and emergency medical personnel would arrive within minutes, and Sarah knew that she was about to face a very different kind of challenge than the one she had just overcome. Explaining a shooting to police officers was a complex process under the best of circumstances. When the person doing the shooting was a recently retired Navy SEAL who had been trying to maintain a low profile in civilian life, the situation became exponentially more complicated. Sarah made a quick decision. She carefully placed the captured weapon on the counter and stepped away from it, raising her hands to show that she was no longer armed. When the police arrived, she wanted to make absolutely certain that there could be no confusion about who was a threat and who was a victim. The sirens were getting closer, and Sarah could hear multiple vehicles approaching. This was going to be a big response, which meant lots of questions, lots of paperwork, and lots of attention she had been hoping to avoid. But, as she looked around the coffee shop at the people she had protected, at Patrick Murphy who was alive because she had acted, at Mrs. Chen and Marcus and Janet and all the other innocent people who had been caught in someone else's violent plans, Sarah realized that avoiding attention was far less important than the satisfaction of knowing she had used her skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The first police car pulled up in front of Murphy's coffee shop just as the third gunman had probably reached whatever vehicle had brought them to the scene. Sarah hoped the police would be able to catch him, but even if they didn't, he would spend the rest of his life knowing that he had run away and abandoned his partners when faced with real opposition. Patrick Murphy walked over to stand beside Sarah as they waited for the police to enter. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly, "but I know what you did. You saved my life, and probably the lives of everyone else in here. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement, but she was already thinking ahead to the conversation she was about to have with law enforcement officials, reporters, and possibly military investigators who would want to know why a retired Navy SEAL had been involved in a shooting at a civilian coffee shop. Her quiet transition to civilian life had just become much more complicated, but she found that she didn't regret her actions for even a moment. This was why she had trained for 12 years. This was why she had endured the hardest military preparation in the world. Not for glory or recognition, but for moments exactly like this one, when training and courage could make the difference between tragedy and survival. The coffee shop door opened, and the first police officers entered with their weapons drawn, ready to face whatever dangerous situation had been reported. Sarah kept her hands visible and waited to begin the long process of explaining what had happened and why a simple Tuesday morning coffee break had turned into something that would change all of their lives forever. The first police officers through the door of Murphy's coffee shop were Portland Police Bureau patrol officers Michael Rodriguez and Jennifer Walsh. They entered with weapons drawn, expecting to find an active shooter situation based on the multiple 911 calls that had flooded the emergency dispatch center. What they found instead was a scene that would puzzle investigators for weeks to come. Two men lay on the floor of the coffee shop. One was unconscious with what appeared to be a head injury, while the other was conscious but bleeding from a shoulder wound and crying out in pain. A woman in her mid-30s stood near the counter with her hands raised, clearly unarmed but somehow radiating an aura of complete control over the situation. Scattered around the room were frightened but uninjured civilians, all of whom seemed to be staring at the woman with expressions of amazement and gratitude. Portland Police. Officer Rodriguez announced, though it was obvious that whatever danger had existed was now over. "Everyone stay where you are and keep your hands visible." Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands raised and her voice calm when she spoke. "Officers, my name is Sarah Martinez. The situation is secure." These two men attempted to rob this establishment and threaten customers with firearms. I was able to disarm them and defend the civilians present. Their weapons are on the counter, and I am unarmed. Officer Walsh kept her weapon trained on Sarah while Officer Rodriguez moved to secure the guns that had been placed on the counter. Even though Sarah appeared to be cooperating fully, the scene was unusual enough that both officers remained on high alert. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around slowly and place your hands on the wall," Officer Walsh instructed. "This is just procedure until we can sort out what happened here." Sarah complied without protest, allowing herself to be handcuffed while additional police units arrived outside. She understood that from the officer's perspective, she was the person standing over two injured men in the aftermath of a shooting, which made her the primary suspect until the situation could be clarified. Paramedics rushed into the coffee shop and immediately began treating the wounded gunman's shoulder. The bleeding had been controlled by Sarah's first aid, but he would need surgery to remove bullet fragments and repair damaged tissue. The unconscious gunman was beginning to stir, groaning and holding his head as he slowly returned to awareness. Detective Lisa Park arrived on scene 15 minutes after the initial police response. She was a 20-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau with extensive experience in violent crimes and officer-involved shootings. But, as she surveyed the scene and began interviewing witnesses, she realized this case was unlike anything she had encountered before. "This woman," Patrick Murphy told Detective Park, his voice still shaking from the adrenaline of the experience, "she saved all of us. I had a gun pressed to my head, and I thought I was going to die. Then, she moved like nothing I've ever seen. She took that weapon away from him like he was a child, and then, she protected all of us when his partners started shooting." Mrs. Chen, despite her limited English, managed to convey a similar story. "Very brave woman," she said repeatedly. "Very fast. Like movie, but real. She save everyone." Marcus, the college student, was more detailed in his account. "Detective, I've never seen anything like it. One second she was just sitting in her booth reading a book, and the next second she was across the room disarming that guy. The way she moved, the way she handled that situation, it was like she was trained for it. Like she'd done it before." Janet, the artist, had actually been sketching when the attack began, and her artist's eye had captured details that other witnesses might have missed. "She knew exactly what she was doing," Janet explained. "Every movement was purposeful. When she fired that gun, she hit exactly where she was aiming, even with people running around and chaos everywhere. That's not luck. That's professional training." As the witness statements poured in, Detective Park began to piece together a picture that seemed almost impossible to believe. According to everyone in the coffee shop, Sarah Martinez had single-handedly neutralized 3 armed attackers, protected 17 civilians, and ended a dangerous situation with minimal injury to anyone except the criminals themselves. But Detective Park had been in law enforcement long enough to know that ordinary citizens, even those with concealed carry permits or basic self-defense training, didn't handle armed confrontations with that level of skill and composure. The witness descriptions suggested someone with extensive military or law enforcement training, someone who had faced life-or-death situations before and emerged victorious. When Detective Park finally got the chance to interview Sarah privately, she found herself facing a woman who answered questions with the precision and directness of someone accustomed to debriefings and official inquiries. Ms. Martinez, Detective Park began, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened here this morning, from the beginning. Sarah's account was detailed, chronologically accurate, and completely consistent with the witness statements. She described noticing the suspicious behavior of the three men, recognizing the signs that they were armed and planning something illegal, and making the tactical decision to act when the situation escalated to the point where innocent lives were in immediate danger. You seem remarkably calm for someone who just experienced a life-threatening situation, Detective Park observed. Most people would be shaking, crying, or in shock. You're answering my questions like you're filing a report. Sarah met the detective's eyes steadily. Detective, I think it's time I was completely honest with you about my background. I served 12 years in the United States Navy, with 8 of those years as a Navy SEAL. I retired from active duty 6 months ago and moved to Portland to start a civilian career. What happened this morning was unfortunate, but it wasn't the first time I've had to use force to protect innocent people. Detective Park felt her eyebrows rise involuntarily. Navy SEALs were legendary even within law enforcement circles, known as some of the most highly trained and effective warriors in the world. But she had never heard of female Navy SEALs. I'm going to need to verify that military service, Detective Park said carefully. Female Navy SEALs are, well, that's not something I'm familiar with. The program has been classified until recently, Sarah explained. There were only 37 women who completed SEAL training over the past 8 years, and most of our service records remain classified for security reasons. But I can provide you with contact information for my former commanding officers if you need verification. Over the next several hours, Detective Park made a series of phone calls that would fundamentally change how she viewed the morning's events. The first call went to the Navy Personnel Command in Memphis, Tennessee. After being transferred through several departments and speaking with increasingly high-ranking officials, she was eventually connected to Captain Rebecca Stone, who had been involved in the classified female SEAL program. Detective Park, Captain Stone said when the verification process was complete, I can confirm that Sarah Martinez served with distinction in our most elite special operations units. Her service record includes multiple combat deployments and several classified missions that I cannot discuss over the phone. What I can tell you is that she is exactly the kind of person you would want present in a dangerous situation. Her training and experience are exceptional, even by SEAL standards. Detective Park's second call went to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, where she spoke with Agent David Chen, a specialist in civilian self-defense cases involving former military personnel. Agent Chen's assessment was both reassuring and sobering. Based on your description of the incident, Agent Chen explained, Ms. Martinez's actions sound completely consistent with her training and background. Navy SEALs are taught to assess threats, protect civilians, and end dangerous situations as quickly and efficiently as possible. The fact that she was able to neutralize 3 armed attackers while protecting 17 civilians with minimal casualties actually suggests remarkable restraint and precision. A less skilled person might have panicked and started shooting indiscriminately. Meanwhile, news of the coffee shop shooting had begun to spread through Portland's media networks. Initial reports were confused and conflicting, with some describing a shootout and others reporting a failed robbery. But, as more details emerged from witness statements and police sources, the story took on a different character entirely. By evening, local television stations were leading with variations of the same incredible story. Former Navy SEAL stops armed robbery, saves lives at local coffee shop. The story had everything that made for compelling news coverage: ordinary people in danger, heroic action by an unlikely guardian, and the revelation that one of the military's most secretive and elite units had included women whose service had never been publicly acknowledged. Sarah, still being held for questioning pending completion of the investigation, watched the news coverage with growing unease. She had hoped to transition quietly into civilian life, working as a security consultant and gradually building a normal existence away from the intensity and public scrutiny that came with military service. Instead, she found herself at the center of a media storm that threatened to expose details of her service record that were supposed to remain classified. The situation became more complicated when reporters began investigating Sarah's military background. Freedom of information requests were filed for her service records, though most would be denied due to classification levels. military affairs journalists began reaching out to former Navy personnel, looking for anyone who could provide details about the mysterious female SEAL program that had apparently operated in secret for nearly a decade. By the following morning, Sarah's story had been picked up by national news networks. Cable news channels ran segments about the secret female Navy SEALs and the coffee shop hero. Social media platforms exploded with discussions about women in combat roles, civilian self-defense rights, and the ongoing debates about military service and veteran transition issues. Patrick Murphy found himself overwhelmed by interview requests from reporters who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of Sarah's actions. Despite his gratitude for Sarah's intervention, he worried about the impact the media attention might have on his quiet neighborhood coffee shop. "She saved my life," he told a reporter from the Portland Tribune. "I don't care about her background or her training. I care that when someone pointed a gun at my head and threatened to kill me, she acted to protect me and everyone else in my shop. That makes her a hero in my book, regardless of whatever else people want to make of this story." Mrs. Chen, speaking through her daughter who served as a translator, provided a different perspective that resonated with many viewers. "My mother says that she has lived through wars and violence in her homeland," her daughter explained to a television reporter. "She says that she recognizes someone who has been a protector of peace. This woman has a warrior's spirit, but she uses it to defend others, not to cause harm. That is a rare and precious thing." The two captured gunmen, meanwhile, were facing multiple felony charges including armed robbery, kidnapping, and assault with a deadly weapon. The unconscious gunman, whose name was revealed to be Trevor Morrison, had regained consciousness and was being held in the hospital ward of the county jail. The wounded gunman, identified as Marcus Webb, had undergone surgery to repair his shoulder and was expected to make a full recovery before being transferred to jail to await trial. The third gunman, the one who had fled through the back exit, had been captured 6 hours later trying to cross into Washington state. David Chen, not related to Agent Chen, had been arrested at a truck stop outside Vancouver, Washington, after a multi-state manhunt involving local police, state troopers, and FBI agents. He was found hiding in the back of a semi-trailer, still carrying the gun he had used in the coffee shop shooting. All three men had extensive criminal records involving theft, drug possession, and minor violence, but none had been involved in anything as serious as armed robbery before. Police investigators theorized that they had targeted Murphy's coffee shop because they believed it would be an easy target with minimal resistance and a substantial cash flow from the morning rush. What they had not anticipated was encountering someone with Sarah's level of training and experience. Their plan, such as it was, had been built around the assumption that they would face only frightened civilians and an elderly business owner. The presence of a combat veteran with specialized training in exactly this type of situation had never been considered as a possibility. As Detective Park completed her investigation and prepared to make her final recommendation to the district attorney's office, she found herself dealing with a case that challenged many of her assumptions about civilians, self-defense, and the use of force in protecting others. Sarah's actions had been documented through security camera footage from the coffee shop, witness statements from 17 civilians, and physical evidence from the scene. Every piece of evidence supported the conclusion that she had acted in defense of herself and others, using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat posed by armed attackers. But the case also raised complex questions about how society should view former military personnel who used their specialized training in civilian settings. Should Sarah be celebrated as a hero who saved lives, or scrutinized as a potentially dangerous individual who had brought military-level violence into a neighborhood coffee shop? Detective Park's recommendation would ultimately determine whether Sarah faced any charges for her actions, and her decision would be influenced not just by the legal facts of the case, but by her assessment of Sarah's character, judgment, and the broader implications of her actions for public safety. The investigation was nearly complete, but its aftermath would continue to ripple through Sarah's life, the Portland community, and the broader national conversation about military service, civilian protection, and the price of heroism in an increasingly complex world. 3 weeks after the coffee shop shooting, Sarah Martinez sat in the office of Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in helping military veterans transition to civilian life. The media storm had finally begun to die down, but the personal cost of her moment of heroism was becoming increasingly clear. "How are you sleeping?" Dr. Foster asked, noting the dark circles under Sarah's eyes and the tension in her posture. Not well, Sarah admitted. It's not nightmares about the shooting. I've been in worse situations than that. It's everything that came after. The reporters calling at all hours, people following me to work, strangers recognizing me on the street. I moved to Portland to disappear, and now I'm probably the most famous person in the city. The investigation had officially concluded 5 days earlier with Detective Park's recommendation that no charges be filed against Sarah. The district attorney's office had agreed, issuing a public statement that Sarah's actions were completely justified under Oregon's self-defense statutes and consistent with the protection of innocent life. But legal vindication had not solved the practical problems that her newfound fame had created. Sarah's security consulting business, which had been slowly building a client base among Portland's business community, was now overwhelmed with requests. But many of the new inquiries were from people who wanted to hire the Navy SEAL woman more as a novelty than as a legitimate security professional. Others wanted her to provide personal protection services or train them in combat techniques that were far beyond what any civilian needed or should attempt. More troubling were the interview requests, book deal offers, and movie option inquiries that arrived daily. Publishers wanted her to write memoirs about her classified military service. Hollywood agents wanted to option her life story for action movies. Television producers wanted her to host reality shows about self-defense or survival skills. Everyone wants a piece of the story, Sarah explained to Dr. Foster. But they don't understand that I can't tell most of it. 8 years of my service record are classified at levels that will probably never be declassified in my lifetime. The missions I'm most proud of, the work that actually mattered, I can never talk about publicly. All they want to hear about is the 2 minutes in a coffee shop when I had to hurt people to protect others. Dr. Foster had worked with hundreds of veterans over the past 15 years, but Sarah's case was unique. Most of her clients struggled with transitioning from the structure and intensity of military life to the comparative mundane nature of civilian careers. Sarah faced the opposite problem. Her civilian life had suddenly become more intense and scrutinized than her military service had ever been. The psychological impact was compounded by the nature of her military training. Navy SEALs were taught to operate in the shadows, to complete their missions without recognition or public acknowledgement. The entire culture of special operations was built around anonymity and discretion. Being thrust into the spotlight as a public figure went against everything Sarah had been trained to value. Have you considered moving again? Dr. Foster asked. Starting over in a different city where people don't know your story? Sarah had considered it, but the practical obstacles were significant. Her face had been on television and in newspapers across the country. Internet searches of her name brought up dozens of articles and video clips. Even if she moved across the country and changed her name, she would always be looking over her shoulder for recognition. Moreover, she was beginning to realize that running away from the attention might not be the answer. The emails and letters she received weren't all from reporters and agents. Many came from people who had been inspired by her story, particularly women who were considering military service or careers in law enforcement. One letter had particularly affected her. It came from Maria Rodriguez, a 19-year-old college student in Phoenix who had been considering dropping out of her criminal justice program because she felt intimidated by the male-dominated culture of law enforcement. Your story showed me that women can be protectors too, Maria had written. I never knew there were female Navy SEALs, and seeing what you did in that coffee shop made me realize that I don't have to be afraid of being strong. I'm going to finish my degree and apply to the police academy. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Letters like Maria's made Sarah question whether her desire for privacy was worth the cost of lost opportunities to inspire and mentor other women. The female SEAL program she had been part of remained largely classified, which meant that young women considering military careers had no public role models or examples of what they might achieve. The 3 gunmen who had attacked Murphy's coffee shop were scheduled to go to trial in 6 months. Sarah would be required to testify, which meant reliving the events publicly and in detail. Their defense attorneys were already suggesting that they intended to argue that Sarah had used excessive force, claiming that a trained military professional should have found ways to end the confrontation without anyone being shot. "They're going to try to make me the villain," Sarah told Dr. Foster. "They'll say I could have just scared them off, or wounded them less severely, or found some way to resolve the situation without violence. They'll ignore the fact that one of their clients was holding a gun to an elderly man's head and threatening to execute him." The legal challenges were complicated by the unusual nature of Sarah's background. Most self-defense cases involved civilians with minimal training who acted on instinct and adrenaline. Sarah's extensive military training actually made her situation more legally complex, because prosecutors and defense attorneys could argue that her advanced skills created higher expectations for how she should have handled the threat. District Attorney Michael Thompson had assured Sarah that his office would vigorously defend her actions during the trial, but he had also warned her that the defense would likely try to paint her as a dangerous individual who had brought military-level violence into a civilian setting unnecessarily. "The irony," Sarah reflected, "is that my training actually made me use less force, not more. An untrained person might have panicked and emptied an entire clip. I fired one shot, placed exactly where it needed to be to stop the threat without killing anyone. But try explaining that to people who think all violence is the same regardless of context or precision." Patrick Murphy had become an unlikely source of support during the difficult weeks following the shooting. Despite his own struggles with media attention and the disruption to his quiet coffee shop, he made a point of calling Sarah regularly to check on her well-being. "That place has been my life for 30 years, he told her during one of their conversations. "I've watched this neighborhood change and grow, seen generations of families come and go. But, in all that time, I never felt unsafe until those men walked in with their guns. You gave me my life back, and you gave my customers their sense of safety back. Don't let anyone tell you that what you did was wrong." The coffee shop itself had become something of a local landmark in the weeks following the shooting. People made pilgrimages to see where the Navy SEAL incident had taken place. Patrick had to hire additional staff to handle the increased customer volume, and he found himself constantly fielding questions about Sarah and the events of that Tuesday morning. Mrs. Chen had appointed herself as an unofficial defender of Sarah's reputation. Whenever she heard customers discussing the shooting, she would approach them and insist that they understand how grateful everyone should be for Sarah's presence that day. "Good woman," Mrs. Chen would say in her limited English, accompanied by vigorous nodding. "She saved us. Very brave. Very good." Marcus, the college student who had been studying when the attack began, had started a social media campaign defending Sarah's actions. His hashtag thank you Sarah had been shared thousands of times, primarily by people expressing gratitude for her willingness to risk her own safety to protect others. Janet, the artist, had created a detailed sketch of Sarah from memory, capturing her in the moment when she first moved to disarm the gunman. The sketch showed not aggression or violence, but determination and protective instinct. Janet had offered to give the original drawing to Sarah, but Sarah had asked her to keep it, saying she wasn't ready to have visual reminders of that morning hanging in her apartment. The broader implications of Sarah's story continued to ripple through military and political circles. Members of Congress had begun asking questions about the classified female SEAL program, demanding to know why the public had been unaware of women serving in these elite units. The Department of Defense was facing pressure to declassify more information about women in special operations roles. Admiral Patricia Hayes, who had overseen the female SEAL program during Sarah's service, had been called to testify before a closed session of the House Armed Services Committee. While the details of her testimony remained classified, sources suggested that she had strongly defended the program and argued for greater transparency about women's roles in special operations. The women who served in these units, Admiral Hayes had reportedly told the committee, have proven themselves in combat situations that most Americans will never face. They deserve recognition for their service, and the American people deserve to know what their military is capable of achieving when we remove artificial barriers based on gender rather than ability. The debate over Sarah's actions had also become entangled with broader political discussions about gun rights, self-defense laws, and civilian carry permits. Gun rights advocates held up Sarah's case as an example of why trained civilians should be allowed to carry weapons for self-defense. Gun control advocates argued that the incident proved that only individuals with extensive professional training should be allowed to carry firearms in public. Sarah found both interpretations frustrating because they missed what she considered the central point of the incident. It wasn't about guns, she explained to Dr. Foster. It was about recognizing a threat, making a decision to protect innocent people, and having the training to execute that decision effectively. The weapon was just a tool. The real factors were situational awareness, tactical thinking, and the willingness to accept personal risk to protect others. As the weeks passed, Sarah gradually began to accept that her life had been permanently changed by those 2 minutes in Murphy's coffee shop. She could not return to the anonymous existence she had planned, but she was beginning to see possibilities for using her experience and newfound visibility in positive ways. She had been approached by several organizations that trained law enforcement officers and security professionals. They wanted her to develop training programs that incorporated lessons from her military experience and the coffee shop incident. The idea of teaching others how to recognize and respond to threats appealed to Sarah more than the media opportunities she had been offered. "Maybe this is what I'm supposed to do," she told Dr. Foster during one of their final sessions. "Maybe trying to disappear was the wrong approach. If I have skills and experience that can help protect people, perhaps I have a responsibility to share them rather than hide them." Sarah's decision to embrace her new role rather than fight against it would ultimately lead to the establishment of the Martinez Institute for Civilian Protection, a training organization that would become nationally recognized for its innovative approaches to threat assessment and self-defense. But that was still months in the future. For now, Sarah was simply trying to find peace with the reality that a single moment of violence had revealed truths about her character and capabilities that she could never again hide from the world. She had spent 12 years learning to be a protector in the military, and now she would spend the rest of her life figuring out how to be a protector in civilian society. The 3 gunmen who had changed her life were sitting in jail cells, probably unaware that their failed robbery had transformed a quiet security consultant into a national symbol of courage and capability. They had held a gun to Patrick Murphy's head, expecting to find easy victims. Instead, they had discovered why you should never threaten innocent people when a Navy SEAL is watching. Sarah Martinez's story was far from over, but the chapter that began in Murphy's coffee shop had finally drawn to a close. What came next would be determined not by circumstance or chance, but by her own choices about how to use the gifts and burdens that her military service had given her.